Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for our session this evening about framing and messaging strategy. My name is Kimberly Tucker, and I am on the training team here at Indivisible. We will be joined later in this presentation by my colleague and Indivisible's political director, Danny Negretti. He'll introduce himself to you in just a little bit. But I'm going to go on and get us kicked off. Again, thank you so much for joining us. This section is focused on how we're setting the narrative for what this election is about. We're going to dig into the Indivisible strategic conflict framework, and we're going to talk about some ways that we are messaging the major issues in this election. Next, sorry, I had some problems with forwarding the slide here. So let's get started. Republicans told voters a story. It was a well-crafted story, but as we know, it was based on lies. It was a cleverly crafted story using words like radical, extremists. They used phrases like they're gonna take over our country, they're going to destroy our country. Now, if we look at what's happening today, we know that they were telling, that the Republicans were telling their own story, but they were attributing their story to the left. And all at the same time, they were doing to our country exactly what they were accusing the left of doing. Now, their story, like all good stories, had villains. The villains were Black and brown people who only wanted equal treatment under the law. Their villains were women who wanted equal access to abortions, LGBTQ community members who wanted freedom to love and to make decisions about their families. Their villains were working people and the poor, and their villains even became the water and air. Now they're victims. In the Republican story, their victims became rich people, corporations, and poor white men clinging to their guns. And their heroes. Their hero descended down a glass elevator, and the rest is history. He enlisted his minions, and they went on to enlist and to enact terrible policies that went on to destroy our country. Now's a good time to think about, kind of picture in your mind that storyline and some of the policies that have really shaken you to your core and really changed the contours of our country over the last few years. That's what we're talking about today. If you think about those stories, messaging is how we respond to those stories. That's what good messaging does. It's how we establish what we're fighting for. It's how we establish what we're in opposition to and how we say what the stakes are. And it's how we tell our story. And that's exactly what we're talking about tonight. And thank you so much, Danny. Danny's gonna hop in now and he's gonna go on with the rest of the presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Kimberly. Really appreciate you getting us started there. And I'm really excited to talk to you all tonight about the kind of political landscape that we're in and how our approach to messaging right now is going to fit into that landscape. Now, it's really important to understand who Republicans are targeting with this storytelling that they're doing. And they have been targeting this winnable middle. And we've seen them do it with really aggressive culture war messaging specifically. We've also seen it work in Virginia and even New Jersey last year. We saw really big swings to the right in electorates that were considered pretty reliably blue. Jersey, of course, more blue than Virginia, but Virginia was trending that way. And we saw a lot of those leftward gains really rolled back because of that effective culture war storytelling. So how did they do it? Republicans and their allies had a really clear narrative that they were pushing. This was a story with a villain and a victim and heroes. The villain was critical race theory, especially in Virginia. It was critical race theory and the Marxist academics who were pushing it into our schools. The victim in this story was your students. It was our kids who were feeling guilty when they learned about slavery or when they learned about Jim Crow or the civil rights movement, especially white kids who allegedly felt bad learning about American history. And then they presented the hero. And that hero was you. It was the voter. It was you as a parent who could show up to the school board meetings and yell at the school board members that there were Marxists teaching their kids about critical race theory. It gave you actions to become the hero. And it told you that you had the power to stop that villain. Now, this story played into the insecurities and fears of that mainly white segment of the electorate, and it mobilized them around concerns related to this really fictionalized version of reality. Critical race theory was the primary example here, but we are seeing it now expand to attacks on trans people, attacks on educators themselves, attacks on choice, attacks on schools themselves. And it's really important now more than ever that we use messaging to tell our story. It's how we establish, just like Kimberly said, what we're fighting for, who we are in opposition to, and what the stakes are. Now, unfortunately, I think we're pretty familiar at this point that Democrats haven't really been telling a single cohesive story. In 2021 and 2022, they've often found themselves really unable to meet these lines of attack with the full force of our own convictions. Some Democrats would rather run away from these conversations and say like, oh, that's not our business. We're going to talk about pocketbook issues or kitchen table issues, whatever that means to an individual voter. And then other Democrats, they do want to engage on this, but they choose to do so on the terms set by Republicans. Either way, those aren't effective responses to their storytelling, and it prevents us from developing our own unified storytelling response that's effective. So I do want to talk now about matching our messaging, our storytelling to the moment. If you want to go to the next slide, this is how we understand it. We need better, more direct messaging to tell our story. Sorry, there we go. We need better, more direct messaging to tell our story. We need voters to understand what's at stake and who's acting as the villain, and how those attacks impact us. And most importantly, when they say, most importantly, what they, the voters, as the heroes in this story, can do to win. I love creative writing, but this isn't really about creative writing. We aren't creating fantastical, fictionalized stories here. What we're talking about is real stories with real people. And we're talking about what is already happening today and what we know will happen tomorrow. These are stories about a dad in Highland Park who had to hide his kid in a dumpster as bullets rained around them on 4th of July weekend. This is a story about a 10-year-old rape victim in Ohio who had to travel across state borders into Indiana to get abortion care because her state would not allow her to do that despite being a child victim of rape. These are real victims, these are real stories, and the villains in these stories are so very clear. It is the MAGA Republicans who push the policies, who enable these events, and make sure that we are living in this world. Telling these stories means going on offense and pursuing direct conflict with Republicans on these issues where they have really extremist, wild, unpopular views. That's the story that we want to tell in this election. That's what we want people to think this election is about. It's about Republican extremism on democracy. It's about MAGA extremism on guns, on abortion, on LGBTQ rights, and on education. So when we're talking about building this kind of story and setting this narrative, there are some really important building blocks that we think are beneficial to build into this messaging. Now, this isn't an answer for everything. This isn't going to solve the Democrats' messaging problem, but this is how we think we can have the most impact in telling our story in this election. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to outline what some of those building blocks are. The first of those building blocks is that radical MAGA Republicans are winning. That's not meant to be demoralizing. I think for some people it might be. And so make sure that when you're communicating in this way, it's important to modulate that. But it is important to explain to people what this means. The Republican Supreme Court has been calling the shots, and the right-wing fundamentalists like Ted Cruz and Marjorie Taylor Greene are pulling the strings for their entire party. They're supported by a sophisticated media apparatus. They've got AstroTurf campaigns run by DC think tanks that are bringing that revisionist history and old school homophobia into our schools. And there are conservative politicians across the country who are really hoping for higher office, and they're targeting our children to get a leg up on their rivals. We are being dragged backwards by these people, but it doesn't have to be that way. The next building block to this storytelling effort is to make it clear that we won't go back. We have fought too hard and for too long to let unelected lawyers and television personalities destroy it all. As it stands today, we're on track to have fewer rights and opportunities than our parents did. This destruction of the American experiment is the right wing's goal, but overwhelming majorities oppose this rollback, and we, the normal majority, won't stand for it. The next building block in this is to make it clear that we're not just going to fight back, we are going to fight forward. When we are attacked, we can't look the other way, turn the other cheek. I love Michelle Obama, her quote about when they go low, we go high is a classic quote, but I really do like another quote out of the Obama administration alum, when they go low, we kick them in the teeth. That's a really important way to approach this work. We cannot simply take the high road or wait for November. We need to answer in kind. We need to answer LGBTQ teachers being attacked as groomers by grabbing the mic and making it clear that Republicans are the primary threat to kids. And these attacks on education are just one part of that grotesque threat. The answer to SCOTUS's overturn of Roe is to proclaim loudly and clearly that the Republican Supreme Court is not just kicking it back to the states for voters to decide. They and their political allies want a total abortion ban nationwide, and they will go further. They will outlaw same-sex marriage. They will outlaw contraception. We can't simply defend on the terms that they are setting. We need to go on offense. That's really what strategic conflict is about. And then finally, the last building block here is no more sidelines. The purpose of this kind of messaging, this escalation, is to bring these fights to that winnable middle. In addition to mobilizing activists, you and me and the rest of us, we need to reach the kind of people who might have been receptive to those critical race theory lies last year. You know, folks who voted for Joe Biden and then they were getting concerned about what was happening in schools and then they decided to vote for Glenn Youngkin. We need those folks to vote the right way. And that means painting a picture of Republican overreach that is invading our communities and remaking those communities as progressive right-wing enclaves. We need voters to be moved to action to protect their families and their rights. Preventing a conservative rollback in this story is a patriotic act to protect America, and we need all hands on deck to participate in that. So I mentioned strategic conflict a couple times now. I'm going to talk a little bit about how it works, but ultimately, just to describe it, it is going on offense against the MAGA opposition and setting that narrative. Strategic conflict is all about setting the narrative on what this election is about. Republicans create that strategic conflict through culture war, and they generate a boogeyman. They spread narratives about that boogeyman as a threat, and then they mobilize their base and winnable voters against that threat. Because the Republican approach is rooted in fiction, we have an advantage when we choose to engage. We don't need a boogeyman. We have actual terrible MAGA Republicans who are still around, who are saying things daily that they're just offering us up on a silver platter, things to attack them on. And we need to take advantage of those opportunities. We need to be telling our story and setting the narrative because we want to make sure that those Republicans eat their own positions for lunch. So the first step in doing this is identifying that conflict, identifying that issue. Picking your battles is the model to live by in politics and elections. And by refusing to engage in Republican framing, we can cut through the noise and fight against some real enemies here, that right-wing extremism that is invading our communities. This strategic conflict work starts here, identifying which national fights to engage in and putting the authoritarians on defense. Here we are talking about issues on which Republicans hold drastically unpopular positions, and we've ID'd 3 categories of conflict for this. The first is the MAGA attacks on people. We talk about that as being attacks on choice and healthcare, attacks on LGBTQ people. The second is MAGA attacks on schools. We talk about this being in the context of attacking trans students who are trying to use their own bathrooms or simply participate in sports. We talk about this as attacks on teachers as being groomers. And this is, of course, attacks on critical race theory as they define it. Ultimately, it's an attack on public schools themselves, and we need to say that very clearly, that Republicans are trying to take public schools away. And then finally, of course, we're all familiar, we've been watching the January 6th hearings, attacks on democracy. These are the efforts to come between you and your ballot, to undermine ballots that have already been cast. And these are the areas, these 3 categories are the areas where we see the biggest gap between the Republican position, the mainstream Republican position, and public opinion. These are places where we would say we have a strategic advantage. So the next step, once you've identified which issue to lean into, that's when you become fighters in the conflict. For the past 5 years, indivisible groups have been really effective advocates and effective electoral campaigners through tools, mainly through making calls to congressional offices, through calling voters, using phone bank tools or texting. But now we want to develop kind of a different muscle and focus on that for a little bit. We'll still be doing the rest of it. We're still an important part of winning an election, but this messaging work is really about building this effective new front on controlling the public narrative. And we can do that through local fights with MAGA authoritarians by seizing the mic and driving the conversation. We'll talk a little bit more in future sessions and give some examples of what grabbing the mic and driving the conversation looks like. But once we're able to do that, once we're able to set up what the stakes are, start telling that story, the next and final step is to amplify it, to shift the national narrative. If a conflict happens and nobody sees it, it really didn't matter for our purposes. But Indivisible grassroots groups infrastructure can amplify that strategic conflict that you all are engaging in for the world to see. And in doing so, we can answer for larger audiences that all-important question: what is the most important thing happening right now, and who is to blame? So that was just a little bit of how we navigate the many issues that we're facing and take advantage of these fights. But I want to talk in a bit more specific detail about what this looks like narratively. So let's start with MAGA attacks on people. Here we're using the embrace, replace, because structure. This is a very useful model. And basically what it is just that we want to embrace the messaging in blue, replace the content in red, and then the dark blue column there explains why we're doing that. And it's helpful to include that explanation of why in this work. So again, when we're talking about attacks on people, we're talking about abortion rights, we're talking about attacks on the LGBTQ+ community. And in this particular category, we want to embrace, as an example here, the message that Republicans are planning to push a total abortion ban. We want that to be the topic of conversation because that is what's unpopular. We want that the national effort around banning abortion to be the topic instead of Republicans' preferred talking points. So when you hear something about the Supreme Court returning it to the states, we need to reorient and say clearly, no, they're planning to push a national abortion ban. It's not going to be up to your state, your red state, or your blue state. It's going to be up to politicians and lobbyists. That is just the first example. We can talk next about MAGA attacks on schools. Again, attacks on schools includes attacks on trans students, attacks on LGBTQ students and teachers, the refusal to engage with gun safety efforts, and then of course attacks on accurate history using critical race theory as a bogeyman. So if we go to the slide on attacks on schools, you can see that we want to embrace the very clear statement that Republicans are working to ban books and censor history. We can even be more specific about it. They want to ban books from Black authors. They want to ban books from civil rights advocates and censor our history of slavery and Jim Crow. I think there was a story recently about how I think Florida was recommending they don't use the word slavery anymore, but involuntary servitude or something along those lines, some euphemism, because slavery made some people feel bad. We need to talk about that specifically instead of getting into arguments over CRT, over what CRT is, over where it's taught. We are falling into their trap when we get into debates over critical race theory. And that's because critical race theory is not the issue here. The issue is the right wing's anti-education push and the way they're targeting our history and our students to achieve it. Finally, the attacks on democracy. As I mentioned, it's attacks on voting rights, it's election subversion, it's attacks on election officials, it's everything that we saw in 2020 and on January 6th and more. When we're talking about this, we want to communicate clearly that MAGA is laying the groundwork for overturning future elections and taking away your vote. We need to set up the stakes, not just for democracy as a concept, but for voters as individuals. We want to focus on that future effort that they are building towards, instead of simply saying that it was January 6th or that the coup in 2020 failed, because this is an ongoing assault. It was not a one-time event. It's really important to communicate to people and to reorient their thinking around what is happening today and what will happen tomorrow, rather than what already has happened, and allow them to move on from it. So that is just a quick rundown of these 3 category areas that we identified. A lot can fit into these 3 categories, and we have a lot more messaging content to be included here. But I definitely think that it's important to practice some of these kind of pivots and redirections as we're building this case, telling our story, making sure that we are building a cohesive narrative and not chasing the Republicans' narrative. I'm going to pass it back to Kim now as she talks a little bit about how this has shown up in different places.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Danny. I tell you, it is so exciting to think about Democrats seizing the mic, setting the narrative, and exposing these drastically opinions. And that is exactly what we're going to do. So right now, I want you to think just a little bit about which one of these issues might be showing up in your community and how you at the local level can seize the mic and expose the unpopular opinions that your elected officials might have. And as you think about that, we want to share a success story with you about how one indivisible group did just that. So Indivisible Bucks County engaged in a prolonged multi-layered strategic campaign using strategic conflict, where they seized the mic and used effective messaging that exposed and told the true story of Republican Representative Brian Fitzgerald's extreme views on abortion. Now, throughout the course of their campaign, they engaged press, peers, and persuadables in this multi-layered campaign. This is how they did it. First of all, they used some data that indicated that there was that the public didn't really know that he had these views. And so what they did was they launched deep canvassing teams to go out into the community and talk to voters about their views on abortion. And as they talked to voters, they found out that people really didn't even understand that he had these really extreme views. And again, this is not just one day of action or one rally. This was an extended, lengthy campaign. And then over the course of this deep canvassing campaign, they were able to find out voters' views, find out and expose Fitzpatrick's views to them. And then I'm gonna play just a little bit of this video in the background, and you'll be able to see this rolling billboard where they, on Independence Day, they took this rolling billboard and they went to different locations throughout the city, and they really took the fight to the congressmen and to the community and exposed, see here, I voted to defund Planned Parenthood, don't send anti-choice extremist Brian Fitzpatrick back to Congress. They talked about some effective messaging, keep abortion legal. So they took the rolling billboard throughout the community and they really exposed his views. Now, how did they engage their peers? They knew that what they needed to do was to make sure that they engaged and used strong recruiting techniques. So when they had huge rallies, they used QR codes and text to numbers to make sure that they were able to connect with people who came and gather their information, so they made it easy for people to connect with them for future actions and future events. Now, as Danny said, if you take the fight And if you seize the mic and nobody knows about it, it didn't really happen. So what they did was they also engaged the press. So they did an extended letter writing campaign where they wrote letters to the editor, and they were even successful at making sure that they got press. And so here you see on this slide, they were able to get some national press in USA Today. So this is how we use Indivisible's strategic conflict strategy. And if we use strategic messaging tactics that we've shared with you, we are, and while we do it, we engage peers, press, and persuadables, we are able to win. Now, I just wanted to show you, this is not just using a hunch. Indivisible Bucks County used data, and here's a poll that they used to inform their decision that showed that there was really some data behind their decisions. You want to make sure that all of the decisions that you use are data informed. So there is training available that will be doing a deep dive in how to engage your peers using messaging and strategic conflict, how to engage the press, and how to engage your peers. We'd like to make sure that you know is available, and we'll make sure that you know how to find that training. Additionally, there is going to be follow-up training on messaging, and there's also going to be on August 2nd, stay tuned, there's going to be some training available to you on bird dogging. And so we want to make sure that you have all the tools available to make sure that you seize the mic and take control of the narrative and use these strategies, and that's how we win. Thank you so much for joining us, and we're looking forward to success in November.